Hi everybody, thanks so much for coming in today on a slightly misty London afternoon. I appreciate you guys coming in and taking the time out from your lunch break or whatever else you could be doing to come and have a chat. My name is Jason Dittmer and I teach here in the Department of Geography, and one of the things that I've done for quite a while now is famously small niches in academia, which is the overlap between Captain America and political geography. I don't worry too much about other people kind of crowding into my ecosystem because it is about the most obscure sort of Venn diagram you can imagine, but it's mine, right? So, but I'm happy to share this with you guys today. I actually stopped writing about Captain America a while ago. This is what we're going to talk about today. And it kind of culminated in this book, Captain America and the Nationalist Superhero. And I really thought I was done. You know, it's sort of like I kind of plowed this field for about 10 years. And in the end, you're like, okay, good. I can finally finish being comic book guy at the conferences and all of that. And and then over the last year or so, something seemed to be happening in the world, and I kept thinking, oh my God, if only I was still doing Captain America. And so I've, much like a superhero, I've revived him for a little bit, right? Nobody ever dies in the world of superheroes, except for the bad guys. And so I revived the project here a little bit for you. Funny story about the book was that when I was doing it, I wanted to put pictures in. You'll see I have a lot of pictures from comic books in this talk. And what I did was I was in contact with the legal people at Marvel Comics, as you might imagine. They're kind of proprietary about these things. It's their whole business. And so I wrote to them and I said, look, you've been really helpful over the years with letting me publish these pictures. I'm doing a book now. I was kind of hoping to have 25 pictures or so. What do you guys think? And they said, oh, well, that should be fine. No problem. Send us through the pictures you want to have. And they said, but also, you mentioned the name of the book is Captain America and the Nationalist Superhero. And that sounds kind of like someone might think it's one of our books, because it sounds like, Scooby-Doo and the Temple of Doom or something like that, right? Captain America and the National Superhero. And they said, would you just send us the cover? And so I sent them this picture, which is a modified version of a painting from Korea, which is updated for Iraq, and it's called Massacre at Haditha. And she wrote back like within 2 minutes, and she was like, yeah, nobody's going to think that's one of our books, so have at it. So anyway, what I want to do today is cover really two topics, in a way, which are loosely connected. And the title of the talk, as you may remember, is Trump in the Age of Captain America, and then Captain America in the Age of Trump. And that's really, it's kind of a tale of two halves here. So it's really a third. The first third is going to be about Trump in the age of Captain America. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the rise of Trump and other related phenomena. Actually, it's election day here, so we'd be remiss if we didn't think about this a little bit, maybe in the question and answer period. And then on the second half of it, I want to trace some of the events that happen in Captain America comics over the last 15 or 20 years, which I think kind of show us, if you will, the evolution of America to the point where we end up with President Trump. So that is what I'm going to do today. Everybody all right? Everybody excited? Are you ready to go on this journey? The wall of apathy. Superman would smash right through a wall of apathy, and I'm going to do the same. So I want to talk to you about a man, a great American, a man who can solve problems, the man who could cut through all of the bureaucracy that's been shackling this great nation. I just literally tore through the floor of the stage. A man famously so masculine, his hands are enormous. Okay? That man is Captain America. And as I was watching the story unfold, right, the campaign, as many of us were kind of shocked and amazed, I kept thinking, this all sounds so familiar. And so I went back through my archive. I do have, if I may say so, the geekiest set of file cabinets in UCL. I have at least a copy of every Captain America published from 1963 to the present in my file cabinets. So I went back through, and I found this story. Okay, this is Captain America number 250. The date for it is October, which actually means November in terms of when it came out. You know how magazines are, they post-date everything. November of 1980. So it came out the same time as the election was being held between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, in which Reagan goes on to win the presidency. And in the story, Captain America saves a party convention, a third party called the New Populist Party, and from a terrorist attack. And this guy, who, as you can tell from his suit, is a party boss, turns to Captain America afterwards and says, "How would you like to be our candidate for president?" And Captain America over here says, "Oh, thanks a lot, but I'm not much of a politician." And the party boss says, "The people don't want a politician, they want a leader." We can go on here. He says, I'll read off this screen if I may. He says, "We keep offering the same kind of political idiots the Democrats and the Republicans keep putting up. The people want to change, Cap, and you could be that change." And so other guys start coming around. "People want a real leader for president. People wouldn't have to settle for the lesser of two evils. They actually have someone to vote for." And they say, "Come on, you can do it, you can do it." And here, the best part is when they start arguing over the workload of saving the world. There must
Sorry for not being here, man. I do apologize. I was caught up myself, man. I'm freaking sweating so much.
that Captain America might be their candidate for president, right? There's no such publicity that could be quite as good. And so his friends say, "If Cap runs, I might just vote this year." And his other friend says, "You're telling me you don't usually vote?" And he says, "Afraid so. Heck, there's never been anyone worth voting for, but if Cap runs." And then, again, Steve Rogers, voice of reason, says, "Would you actually vote for a guy who's wearing a mask?" Right? That doesn't seem like, quite frankly, very democratic. And the response is, well, hey, better than voting for some crook who doesn't wear a mask. And then Steve Rogers says, "Yeah, but what does Captain America know about foreign affairs or energy or inflation?" And this is his girlfriend, quite frankly, my favorite of his girlfriends, just so you know. That doesn't matter, but you know, we all have these rankings. She says, "Oh, Steve, what do any of the candidates really know about those topics?" Right? So again, you see this, a lot of themes that came up in the US presidential thing, right? Sure, you know, Trump is a lech who openly talks about sexual assault and went bankrupt 6 times, but Hillary Clinton, right? She, you know, who wants to vote for her? There's nobody to vote for. She says, "Wouldn't it be great to have a president you knew you could trust?" So, you know, the fact that and he ends up, by the way, not running for president. After the whole issue, he decides not to. The whole thing's a big tease. But I think what you see are the themes of a sort of populist presidency, one that's post-ideological, one that, in this case, is a third-party presidency. We could equally talk about Donald Trump as essentially a third-party candidate who took over the Republican Party, right? I mean, he literally was a third-party candidate in, what, 2000 or 2004, something like that. So I think the parallels here are quite telling. Now, I promise you there are only 2 academic quotes in this presentation. One of them is me, and since the whole thing is essentially an academic quote, we won't even count this one. So there's one other academic quote. This one is from my book, and I write that superheroes are already a form of carnival. And here I mean a sort of Mikhail Bakhtin's notion of carnival as an upending of social. In this case, as a third-party presidency, right, where the people on the bottom of the social ladder get to be princes and kings and, you know, run the carnival for a while, and then they go back to being the oppressed. The cheerful way of thinking about carnival. Superheroes are already a form of carnival that overprivileges physicality and exaggerates the body. It is often the villain who is the intellectual rather than the hero, right? Think about like Lex Luthor or the Joker, right? These are characters who are not known for great fighting, right? They are smart. They are trying to connive their way into power. The intellectual's humiliation at the hands of the superhero is to be celebrated. In contrast to our everyday dependence on a complex and rationalized society and its systems, in superhero narratives, it is society that relies on the individual. Right? I love this quote. Whoever wrote this is obviously on top of their game. But I think if we think about what Donald Trump, for instance, offered to do, right? He said, I'm the only one who can fix Washington, right? I'm going to go in there, I'm going to sort it out, I'm going to make the deals, I'm going to straighten this thing out. I will make America great again, right? It's very much a sort of individual, sort of physical presence, right? He is kind of famously I don't want to say hefty because that sounds judgmental, but he is an imposing physical presence. He is also, if we really wanted to go down this road, he is kind of obsessed by the body in a lot of ways, both his own in terms of he doesn't drink or do anything like that, and he's obviously obsessed with other people's bodies. We could go down that road, but we won't. This is a family-friendly presentation. So in any event, what we see is this upending, right, in which, if you will, the bullies of society who normally kind of get pushed aside are at the center, and they are the solution to our problems. Now, writing at the exact same time is William Connolly. He's a political theorist slash, as far as I can tell, someone who can read the future, because when you see this quote, you'll think he knew what was coming. He writes, anxious white males in the working and middle classes seek models of masculinity with whom to identify in a world of uncertainty. Corporate elites, sports heroes, financial wizards, and military leaders project images of independence, mastery, and virility that can make them attractive models of identification, whereas state welfare programs, market regulations, retirement schemes, and healthcare, while essential to life, may remind too many of the very fragilities, vulnerabilities, susceptibilities, and dependencies they strive to deny or forget. I love putting those quotes next to each other. One, because William Connolly is way smarter than me, and me putting myself next to him elevates me. But also, right, he's really getting at, I think, a diagnosis of this current moment, right? Especially in America. What is it that Donald Trump is threatening to get rid of? Healthcare, regulation, all of these kind of feminizing systems that he has transcended as a corporate elite. Right? We could throw superheroes into that list of masculine models, couldn't we? At least until Wonder Woman came out this last week. And now we're all thinking differently about that. Okay. Does that make sense? Thank you. One person nods. The wall of apathy slowly crumbling. I can see cracks. So I want to talk for a little bit about the way in which, it's okay, we can laugh. Captain America and Trump came together in a very specific way, not just this kind of academic way that I was talking about in the last bit, right? I was struck in November when the election rolled around. I have a very diverse group of friends because I'm from the South in the US, so I have a lot of progressive friends, I have a lot of conservative friends. And I was struck by how my Facebook feed and my Twitter feed were full of these images that were all invoking Captain America, right? So here you see just a couple of the images. There's many more, I promise you, in which Trump is quite kind of unabashedly being associated as Captain America, right? Again, this sort of masculine figure, patriotic, solving problems, sorting things out, and so on. And equally, after he won, we saw a rapid invocation of both Captain America and also Indiana Jones, which was great fun, as a kind of a different invocation of America, right? As that which will fight back against these kind of, especially the alt-right stuff. Richard Spencer, if you recall, all of these kind of goose-stepping alt-right people, kind of horrifying vast swaths of America because all of a sudden they were on TV, right? Of course, they were always there. But now they're all of a sudden having a rally that's 3 blocks from the White House, and they're being taped doing Hitler salutes, right? So a lot of people said, right, let's go and take care of this. Now, the doubleness of both the last slide and this slide is quite frankly pretty inherent to the superhero itself, right? In particular, Captain America. Captain America was, according to the story, right, a super soldier created by the American government with chemicals to fight the Nazis, right? And yet, at the same time, he is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed kind of Ubermensch, right? He very easily could have been sort of Hitler's dream child, right? So the kind of doubleness of what he fights against versus what he is kind of an interesting tension that's built in, quite frankly, to a lot of superheroes, but especially to Captain America. I wanted to show this clip, if I may. This is, if you remember, Richard Spencer punched in the street. Let's watch.
Nazis don't love me. They kind of hate me, actually.
Following the KKK, neo-Nazi.
NATO's people don't like me,
Are you
to be
like
honest.
the hipster version of the neo-Nazi movement?
It's, Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Good work, soldier. Shield flag. Freedom prevails.
So, for those of you who are students
Thumbs
in the
up,
room,
soldier.
yes, that is actually what we played as video games in the 1990s. There were a whole rash of these movies being produced. Was punched out. I picked this one for pretty obvious reasons, but equally kind of impressive was the fact that on Facebook there was, or not on Facebook, especially on Twitter, there was a big discussion about whether it was okay to punch Nazis. Right? Now, first off, there's already a really interesting elision between Richard Spencer and Nazis, okay? But there were a lot of people saying, literally, well, if it's good enough for Captain America, it's good enough for me, right? Captain America will punch a Nazi. Indiana Jones will punch a Nazi. My granddad killed Nazis, or whatever. Which is kind of all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, are you saying you should be able to kill Richard Spencer? That doesn't really help your argument, I don't think. But the debate that unfolded online, they actually had two different writers of Captain America debating each other on this topic. And I thought, is this what we've kind of gotten to, that like we think writers of Captain America are the moral arbiters of like how we should live? But there we were. So Captain America kind of gets enmeshed in these debates. And indeed, this guy was a city councilman who was elected in San Jose, California, and he brought his own personal Captain America shield, I guess, out of his basement and in to do his swearing-in ceremony. He said, the shield represents America's ideals, and I do hope to aspire to those ideals of fair play, equal justice, and democracy during my term. If you read further down in the article, he also says, I already had the shield, and I just thought it would be fun. So I'm not sure we should impute too much kind of political idealism here, but made for a great shot. Now, I want to tell a slightly more complicated story, maybe, about kind of America and politics here. So moving away from sort of social media and the election. For most of its history, right, Captain America and Marvel Comics have really struggled to avoid any kind of political attributions to Captain America, okay, besides the fact that he's pro-America, which is obviously pretty political. But if we kind of assume Captain America is going to be pro-America, then there were all sorts of people always, for decades now, saying, what would Captain America think about, desegregation or, any kind of political issue? And generally speaking, they would avoid any whiff of controversy. So for instance, when someone would write a letter to the editor, which happened about every couple of years, what is Captain America? Is he a Democrat, a Republican, what? And they would say, Captain America was born in the 1920s in New York. He would have come of age during the New Deal, right, which was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's kind of welfare state initiative. So we would think he's a New Deal Democrat, okay, which is a great way of saying he's right in the middle of everything, right? Because, of course, the New Deal was something that created Social Security, lots of public spending. It kind of created the federal government as the thing which it became. And so both parties, for many decades, agreed with that, okay? There was what we call the liberal consensus, right? That the Republicans and the Democrats would disagree on various things, but there was a whole swath of things they agreed on. It just seems lovely now. I just imagine that, like slipping into a warm bath where everyone agrees with each other. Intriguingly, it's actually that Carter-Reagan election that Captain America almost ran in is really the beginning of the end of that liberal consensus, right? As Reagan starts to shift to a more conservative terrain, which most Republicans now emulate or quite outflank, actually. It's worth noting that people like Nixon, who we think of as kind of right-wing Republicans, he actually created the Environmental Protection Agency, right? That was a kind of New Deal. It was much later than the New Deal, but it was, again, one of these consensus things. So Captain America, for instance, never goes to Vietnam despite being a superhero, or excuse me, a super soldier for the American government. He doesn't partake in Vietnam because they knew it was a divisive thing and they would never want Captain America to take an issue. I should say he went twice, but never kind of to fight with American forces. So in a way, those are the exceptions that prove the rule. This all starts to change in this post-liberal consensus era, right? And in particular with the rise of the second Bush administration, right, or George W. Bush's administration and the war in Iraq and the sort of intensification of already existing animosities within the American political system. And so in 2007, there was a storyline called Civil War, which was widely read as being a proxy for kind of the Bush era Patriot Act controversies. Okay, so the story, this is the part of every talk where I start to feel awkward because I have to explain superhero plot lines, which inherently make me sound ridiculous. So if I should put like a red nose on or something just to accentuate that this is playtime. But so in the story, basically the US government decides that you can't have all these vigilante superheroes running around with superpowers doing whatever they want. And so they are going to be registered with the government and basically become government agents. And this divides the superhero community with one group led by Iron Man saying, hey, this makes sense, which of course it does, for the same reason we don't let private citizens have tanks or nuclear weapons. And the other group is led by Captain America, right, who says, no, this is kind of an impingement on liberty, and I shouldn't be forced to register or give up my secret identity or any of these things. Oh, what has happened? Did I do that? Resume. There we go. So in any event, there's of course a big fight, and in the end, Captain America is shot and apparently killed on the courthouse steps as he goes to turn himself in. And this is kind of amazing because, again, the story was so closely identified with contemporary politics. This was seen as an implicit rebuke of the Bush administration by very many observers, right? And this is the headline. You may notice the font. This is the New York Times, which ran an obituary for Captain America. A little bit of irony, perhaps, but nevertheless, it was, I think, on the front page. I can't tell from that, but I recall it was on the front page. And it says, Captain America, a Marvel Entertainment superhero, is fatally shot by a sniper in the 25th issue of his eponymous comic, which arrived in stores yesterday. The assassination ends the Sentinel of Liberty's fight for right, which began in 1941. Now, I might add, the New York Times got it wrong. It started in 1940. Should have consulted the geek in residence. But whatever. I'm not angry about it. I'm not upset that I don't get asked these things. But you know, if someone else wants to be upset on my behalf, that would be fine. So we can also see then how they were trying to still maintain this sense of it being a politically neutral story. So again, this was a media event. Because it was tied to the criticism of the Bush administration, they got on CNN, which of course they're loving because they want to sell comics. So the CNN correspondent says, so if the current storyline is an allegory for the post-9/11 social and political situation, what does the death of Captain America represent? And Joe Quesada, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, says, well, there's a lot to be read in there, but I'm not going to tell, I'm not one that's going to tell people this is what you should read into it, because I can look at it and say, you know, I can read several different types of messages, right? What a waffly bunch of garbage, right? I mean, you're on national television. Say something meaningful. But you can see where they're desperate to not get kind of read as liberal rag or whatever. This echoed throughout a whole variety of different newspapers across the whole country, which ran editorials on the death of Captain America. Now, I'm going to cut to the chase, because I know some of you are worried. Okay? He does come back. Okay? In a very tortured set of storylines, which I will be forced to tell you about before this is all over. So the Miami Herald says, Captain America's shooting culminates an allegorical post-9/11 storyline that has seen him leading the resistance against an edict requiring people with superpowers to register with the government and are designated unlawful combatants. If you recall, that was a catchphrase from a decade ago. And disappeared without trial into secret prisons, a sort of reference to Guantanamo Bay. Am I even in America? Gasps one young hero as he is being led away. That's something many of us have asked in these last years of government-sanctioned torture, secret surveillance, and patriot actions. So people are very explicitly reading into this a Bush critique. Now, you don't have to read it in that friendly of a way. Portland, in perhaps the most peak Portland thing they've ever done, wrote an editorial in the Press Herald that says, from the left comes the view that the captain always represented an America devoid of the substance that makes it great. Oh, how do you talk about a dead man that way? Struggling with profound questions of right and wrong is what Americans do. They're implying that he didn't, right? Because he was Captain America, and he was always a kind of moral force. He still is the kind of center of the Marvel universe. If he says something is right, it probably is. It has allowed us to move on from being slave owners, employers of child labor, and obtuse robber barons, which is to me the oddest turn of phrase there at the end, to the more open and enlightened society we have today. Our moments of national unity are few. Captain America was an anomaly, and in that sense, all that American history finally caught up with him, right? So they're basically saying, good, he's dead, right? To them, he's this example of a sort of imperialist America that needs to be eradicated. Ed Brubaker, who was the writer of that storyline, said that all the fans either wanted Cap to be standing out and giving speeches on a street corner against the Bush administration, and all the really right-wing fans all want him to be over the streets of Baghdad punching out Saddam, right? So again, what's interesting to me, and remember I said about the kind of duality of the character, is that by studiously for so long kind of ignoring any kind of domestic politics, everybody was able to project onto Captain America whatever they wanted him to be. Right? So right-wing fans thought he was just like them. Left-wing fans thought he was just like them. Now, we can get to the past the Civil War storyline and go to 2010. And in 2010, there was a storyline in which Captain America and his African-American partner, a guy named the Falcon, who keep that in mind because we'll talk about him a bit more in a second, go to Idaho to investigate an anti-government plot that was coming on in Idaho. Now, if you know anything about American geography, Idaho is exactly where anti-American government plots come from. It is kind of a famous home for both potatoes, which are large and delicious, but also white nationalists, who are sometimes large but rarely delicious. And so they go up there and they see this kind of protest going on in the streets of presumably Boise, Idaho. And they're looking down on it from above, and they say, well, we should go in. Captain America says, we should go in and investigate. And the Falcon notes that basically the entire crowd is white, and he says, I don't think they're going to want this guy from Harlem coming in and hanging out with them. And now, I said this was a family-friendly presentation. That's almost true. There was, in this set of protesters here, a bunch of placards that you can see. Stop the socialists, no new taxes, etc. This one, teabag the libs before they teabag you, is kind of a famous reference to a real placard that was at a Tea Party protest right around the time that President Obama was elected. Now, if you don't know what that sign means, that means you are a good person and a wholesome person. I will say it is an oblique reference to sexual practices, which were of an embarrassing quality to the Tea Party. But so it was understood that this sign here identified the crowd as the Tea Party, and because they were basically the stooges of the villain, it made the Tea Party the villains, right? If you're fighting Captain America in a Captain America comic, de facto, you are being un-American, right? That is what that means. And so this got picked up by the blogosphere. You can see here, friskaliberal.com got excited about this. Captain America says Tea Parties are racist. And it made a big kerfuffle. And so when Marvel, of course, went out and begged for forgiveness because they don't want this controversy, right? They want to be edgy, but they don't want to be controversial. And so when they reprinted the comic, they changed it. So it says American, not Americant, which incidentally is what I say every morning when I get out of bed. That's how we get through the day. And so they said, look, we're really sorry, it was a mistake. And they blamed this anonymous guy who was made to fill out the placards. They said nobody knew he was going to do that. So that storyline, interestingly, was called Two Americas. Okay? And what's going on now in the comic is actually really kind of intriguing. So if we can think about this notion that you had a liberal consensus, right, in which Captain America was non-partisan, non-ideological, except for all the ways he was obviously partisan and ideological for America. And then over time, they keep trying to sort of tell a story that appeals to all Americans, but they're starting to struggle, right? They're trying to tell an edgy story, but they keep getting called out for being racist or something along those lines. And what I would argue now is interesting is that they've basically given up on this. Okay, so in the story, again, here comes your dork moment, Captain America, Steve Rogers, loses for a time the super soldier serum that makes him the most awesome 90-year-old you've ever seen. Okay? And so he becomes an old man, still a pretty kick-ass old man, if I'm being honest. Is sort of more like Clint Eastwood old man than, my granddad old man. And maybe Jack Palance, one of those kind of old guys. And so because he can no longer really be Captain America, though, he gives the job and the shield to Sam Wilson, the Falcon, right, who becomes the new Captain America. And over time, though, guess what? Captain America again comes back. He gains the super soldier serum again. He becomes youthful and vigorous. And so they both now have their own comic in which they are essentially Captain America. Right? So there is one comic called Captain America Sam Wilson, and there is one called Captain America Steve Rogers. And the events in both comics have become quite controversial. So the Sam Wilson comic, the Sam Wilson comic is interesting because he has essentially adopted a position that he is going to fight for a different kind of America than Steve Rogers did. He has sort of taken up the notion of being, I think of him as the Black Lives Matter Captain America. So he's fighting for racial equality. He is fighting for immigrants. He notably gets his own sidekick, the Falcon, who is a Mexican teenager who's an illegal immigrant into the country. And a lot of these themes come up over and over again. So again, here's an interview in Time magazine with Tom Brevoort, who is the editor. So they say, in the comic, the Red Skull of Hydra, right? So the Red Skull is the longtime villain of Captain America, his nemesis. And Hydra is a kind of American Nazi party, if we're going to kind of be really generalist here. The Red Skull talks about criminal trespassers who make a mockery of America's borders and calls the refugees in Germany an invading army bringing fanatical beliefs and crime to Europe. Obviously, this hate speech is nothing new for the organization, but it sounds like rhetoric we've been hearing this election. Is that purposeful? Now, if you thought the other bit was waffle, remember when they were trying to get out of the Civil War thing? Wait till you read this. We try to write comics in 2016 that are about the world and the zeitgeist of 2016, particularly Captain America. So we can talk about political issues in a metaphoric way. That's what gives our stories weight and meat to them. Any parallels you have seen to situations, real or imagined, living or dead, is probably intentional, but metaphorically, not literally. What? I mean, these guys get paid to say this stuff. So again, they're still trying to waffle their way through it and not be political, and yet clearly they're writing incredibly politically salient stories. Now, happening over in the Steve Rogers comic is a really interesting thing. So Steve Rogers, remember he's 90 years old now. He was born in 1920. He's always been kind of pro-racial equality, but he is, I think of him as kind of like a classic liberal white thing, right? He says, I don't see color, right? Which means he often doesn't see inequality either. And in fact, when they introduced Sam Wilson as the Falcon in the early 1970s, I think it was really interesting because he sort of took Captain America into Harlem and basically showed him the issues there, right? These were things that wouldn't normally appear in a superhero comic. And Captain America was like, oh, wow, I didn't realize this was going on in my America, right? So, you know, Steve Rogers is always a kind of well-intentioned, slightly fusty white liberal. But what they've done is, via another tortured storyline involving the cosmic cube and other things which are far beyond my ability to communicate to you quickly, they've gone back in time, basically, and made it so that Steve Rogers was always a Hydra double agent from his childhood on. And this has been quite controversial. But so here you see him revealing himself, Hail Hydra. This story is literally going on this month. It's kind of reaching its head soon. But what's interesting there is they've taken this notion of a sort of white, fusty Captain America, liberal Captain America, and they've sort of revealed that as basically a closet racism, right? That you know, hey, maybe this kind of colorblindness is kind of, or this kind of seething racism is behind a lot of kind of white American history. I mean, it's kind of an interesting re-narration of the liberal consensus. Meanwhile, in Sam Wilson, Captain America, we see, again, as I mentioned, he's fighting for immigrants. You have these characters called the Sons of the Serpent, which is actually a set of villains who've been around since the 1960s. But here they're apprehending people who are crossing the border. And they say, I can see you have brought enough trouble with you already. Trouble and disease and crime weigh heavy on your backs. And these immigrants say, leave us alone. They say, Lord knows we've tried, but until the mighty wall is built, you come here for employment that is rightfully ours, right? And if denied it, you seek welfare paid for by my tax dollars, right? I mean, ooh, getting quite on the nose there, aren't we? So I think you can see how the two comics are kind of veering. They're both, I think, quite still coming from something of a left angle, if only because Captain America as a Hydra agent is a rather provocative criticism. But nevertheless, they are, if you will, giving up on the idea of one superhero body encompassing all of these different Americas, right? Instead of trying to have one character who holds it all together, they're like, okay, fine, two Captain Americas, one for the Trump people, one for the others. So, to conclude, and I thank you all very much in advance for taking the time to spend with me today. But what I wanted to do was, if you will, go back to these two stories, right? Trump in the age of Captain America and Captain America in the age of Trump, and pull them together, right? Both in the real world, where we see the image of Captain America proliferating, right? Not only onto the movie screens, but all the way through to all of our kind of any digital screen, right? Just like that video of him punching out Richard Spencer, you see Captain America being pulled out of context and sent to do different things by different people, right? The meanings of Captain America are proliferating as all sorts of people, including maybe some of the people in this room, have taken these images and doctored them and photoshopped them and sent them spreading through the internet like a meme virus, right? So we see, if you will, a fragmentation and a multiplication of Captain America to mirror this fragmentation and multiplication of Americas. Remember, the story from 2007 was called Civil War. And then in 2010, we get two Americas. And now we finally have actually two different Captain Americas, right? There is, if you will, this giving up of a center ground, a lack of belief that there's a there anymore. And you know, maybe that's true. And thinking about Trump in that context, right? It's worth, I feel like I'm required to say this as an American overseas. It's worth remembering that he is a sort of minoritarian president, right? He's never been someone who the majority really was onto. He is a product of this kind of fractured America, and he is no more kind of representative of the whole thing than any one of these kind of multiplying images is. So maybe there's some hope there. Thank you all very much for your attention this afternoon. I think do we have time for questions, or how does that work? Yeah? Okay.